craft of film dubbing, that is, recording new dialogue in a foreign language to allow a film to be exported abroad, it's a thankless and mostly anonymous job. It's become an old cliche to mock the stilted voices and the out-of-sync lip movements, but the truth is that without the efforts of those men and women who labored in obscurity to translate and transform films from their native tongues into the English language, it might never have been possible for countless exploitation films from Asia, Europe, and other parts of the world to have ever been released in the United States. And few people have dubbed more films into English than Mr. Ted Thomas, a Hong Kong-based broadcaster, journalist, author, and for many years one of the most prolific dubbing voice actors and directors in this little-known and little-understood business. Thomas provides the voice of the narrator and the Emperor of Seatopia in Godzilla vs. Megalon, and his voice is heard in the English version of a number of other Toho films such as Matango, Dogora the Space Monster, and Godzilla vs. Gigan. That's to say nothing of the literally hundreds of Hong Kong action films he helped bring to the West. Man with the unmistakable voice, welcome Ted Thomas. We're very pleased to speak with you today.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. It's early afternoon here.
We thought it'd be interesting to talk a bit about the process and the business of dubbing films because it's still a subject that's not terribly well understood, and it's certainly not an occupation that gets a lot of respect even now. Dubbing has been the butt of a lot of bad jokes over the years, as you know. But you didn't really start in the film business, did you? Can you tell us a little bit about your background before we get to the dubbing work?
Yeah, I came to Hong Kong working for British Naval Intelligence, actually. After the Korean War, we were trying to prevent smugglers, who later became very respectable and seen very important and wealthy business figures in Hong Kong, and Macau especially, who were smuggling strategic goods against the United Nations regulations into China. China was still, don't forget this is 1955, it had only been going for about 5 or 6 years and was not at all respectable. So they were not receiving the sort of strategic goods they needed to have. And this is not necessarily weapons. These are silly things like kerosene and gasoline and oil and stuff like that. And the boats that used to travel up and down the Pearl River, usually from Macau, were called green parrots. Not that they were green, but they were very, very fast, and they were much faster than the naval boats pursuing them. So we had to be better on the guns when we could hit them.
That's a long way, though, from naval intelligence to the film business.
Well, not necessarily, because when I was in the Mediterranean, I was very keen on broadcasting, and I on board a large aircraft carrier, or a small aircraft carrier, actually, HMS Ocean was a light fleet carrier. They had a studio, and I used to do radio programs, and from there I went to broadcasting in northern Italy, and they had a radio station there, belonged to British Forces Broadcasting, and I started broadcasting on that. That was my first broadcasting. So when I got to Hong Kong and I finally got bored with the intelligence business, I started doing broadcasting part-time and did very well out of it. And from that I was invited by Run Shaw, who now, by the way, is over 100 years old, about 102 or 103 years old, to come in and test out film dubbing and see how I liked it, which I did. And it was very primitive in those days, but I enjoyed it because I used to enjoy doing funny voices. I still do, in fact. So that's how I got into the movie business, through radio broadcasting, through Run Shaw, ultimately, of course, through his successors who started Golden Harvest Films, Raymond Chow, and eventually met and worked with Bruce Lee, and of course doing the dubbing on his films led us to a great deal of success.
But it sounds like you started actually dubbing films into English back in was it the late 50s, early 60s? Is that about when you started?
The late 50s, yeah, it was late 50s. I think it would have been probably 56, 57, something like that.
Okay, so that was well before the Hong Kong action movie boom. And what types of films were you dubbing, and where were they being exported to at that time?
Well, we were getting, first of all, what Run did for the movie industry, of course, he came here, he recognized that Cantonese movies, which were really bad, you know, I mean, so bad that when they wanted this romantic scene, you could see on the screen in the cinema that the moon was a piece of cardboard hanging from a piece of string, and the actual string could be seen on the screen. It was that bad. Run Run decided to widen the audience by recording all his movies in Putonghua, in the Mandarin. So immediately that expanded the audience from Hong Kong and a bit of an audience in Guangzhou at the Canton district to worldwide Chinese. And that's not just China, of course. That was Chinese in America, Chinese in Europe, Chinese in Australia, Canada, and everywhere. So he was on the right track. He was granted a large plot of land to build his studios, and I was his consultant regarding anything to do with the English language.
What were some of the, I don't know if any of the films in those early days that you worked on were actually exported to the United States, but what would have been some of the better known or more popular films that you worked on during that early period?
Well, the original ones were Japanese that Run Run had the agency for. You probably remember Zatoichi, the one-armed swordsman. I mean, it's a tremendously popular series. And we did those, and then we did a lot of other for Tohei Film Company from Japan, and they were usually fairly far-fetched. You know, had to do a lot of grunts and shouts, and not much in the way of dialogue, which we liked best of all because we didn't have to lip sync it. But basically speaking, Runner's best movies at that time were Japanese, who were streets ahead of us in technique for making movies. But as well as that, of course, he soon started bringing films in from Malaysia, from Singapore, of course, not very good films from Singapore. And then they started coming in from South America and from Europe. And I remember dubbing films that were, the original language is Yugoslavian, or one of the Yugoslavian dialects, you know, a Serbo-Croat or something like that. And the thing we sorted out about it was that I didn't even know to start with that you had to cut the film into pieces, sort of 1 minute pieces, and then put it into a loop. And then you crowded around a microphone with the mouth about 10 feet wide, and you fitted the dialogue to the picture, the moving picture. And a friend of mine, a guy called Ron Oliphant in the United States, was later in the United States, was here at the time. He was prepared to sit at home after recording the soundtrack on an audio sound recorder, you know, a tape recorder, and cut it into one, and then go through it inch by inch, I mean syllable by syllable, to make the voice fit. Now, of course, the number of Chinese, Yugoslavian, Japanese words to say the same thing in English is often different. But if it's something very simple, like in Chinese you'd say, for how are you, lei hou ma. But the problem is the closed mouth sounds like M, B, and P.
Mm-hmm.
And you, of course, you can't fake that with dubbing. If the guy says, my mother, he's got to have two closed sounds, and although if you're saying it in Chinese, it's going to be totally different. So this is the thing you had to get around by substituting various words. And the M's, B's, and P's with the closed mouth sounds were always difficult. But Ron Oliphant had immense patience and sat at home with an old half-inch tape recorder, inching through the soundtrack and making the words fit. And the most expensive thing we had was actors, because the good dubbing actors were first class. They could watch a loop go through once or twice and say, right, ready, record. Because they knew the minute they finished, they were out of there to a big slap-up dinner and a few beers and go home. In fact, it was very awkward for new actors who wanted to learn the business, but they couldn't because the old actors were too impatient with them. And say, oh, come on, for Christ's sake, if you can't do, get the fuck out of here. And that's what they had to do. You know, you had to got in and made your way to doing it, or you were out. But we did that mainly through Ron Oliphant's being prepared to sit there hour after hour, going through syllable after syllable and keeping the time of the actors in the studio down to a minimum.
It's an impossible and a thankless job because you just cannot match English words to the mouth movements of someone speaking Chinese or Japanese or Yugoslavian or whatever it is, because the languages.
Well, I don't entirely. I agree with you mainly, of course, and it's unarguable. But in a way, you can make a very good fit. You can make it believable
Mm.
if the actor can act the part. If he's talking in a wooden voice and he's saying something, get back, or I will kill you, of course it's not going to work. But if he can act and he says, get back, or I'll fucking murder you, then it's going to be more believable, even if the lips don't match exactly.
Mm.
So we looked for good actors and also good lip sync dubbers. And in fact, a lot of the problems, you're quite right, when you looked at the finished film, you squirm with embarrassment because it didn't match. But that was when they put the tape recording, which was they first recorded on before they put it onto an optical soundtrack. When they matched it together, they got it wrong. You
Mm.
know, the technical expertise then was nothing like it is today. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
now if I go into to match something to a movie, I don't have to be in a room full of actors. They say, okay, Ted, do that, do your bit there. And I say, oh, I'm sorry, I missed that thing. They say, don't worry, because they can inch it back and forward and make it fit. But
Right.
they couldn't do that in those days. And I think the technology of putting the audio soundtrack that we'd recorded onto a transform to a video soundtrack, or if you like, an optical soundtrack,
Mm-hmm.
was not well enough advanced to make it perfect. Nowadays, even if you don't get it right, you can make a better job. But of course, it still depends a lot on the actors being, to some extent, plausible.
Now, who were the actors? I assume they were all expatriates. Were they Americans, British, Australian?
There were all sorts. They were everybody who could do the part, and if they were reasonable actors and were reasonably sharp enough at matching their voice to the big flapping lips on the screen in front of them, they were okay, and they were kept on.
Did any of them have any prior acting training?
I think some did, yes. I mean, some we got who done acting, both professional and amateur,
Mm-hmm.
and some were natural actors. But you'd only got to do one audition and say, read this part. And as I say, you know, if the guy says, darling, darling, I love you, or he could ooze it and make it sound believable, then you'd know within an instant or two whether the guy was going to be any good as an actor.
Was this something that you could make a living doing, or did most of these people,
Oh yes,
you
yes, you
could?
can make a living because although for the first 2 or 3 years we're the only company doing it, we were a company called Axis International, AXIS, though we didn't use the company name hardly at all. It was all done on a very old boy basis. Yes, you can make a good living out of it, but of course, most of the time you had to do it in the evenings and at nights because the actors were in jobs like full-time broadcasting or media,
Mm-hmm.
and they couldn't get away during the day. So we couldn't start till about 6, and then we'd often go until midnight or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning.
You send some men and keep an eye on him.
Sir. General, Fonzie Yu also had a big following here. Could make trouble. I think we should get him.
Fonzie, you won't cause us any more trouble here. I mean, his own friends will take care of that for us now.
Now, can you walk us through the process of dubbing a film? I mean, for instance, what happens first when you get the job to dub Godzilla versus Megalon? What would be the first thing that happens?
Okay, you first you view the film, of course. So you run through the film, you look at it, and you can then, when you get experience, you can count how many actors. Now there may be 35 actors in the movie, but you recognise that because the voices are so different. One is a sibilant old creep who says, "Hello, it's very nice to meet you, and I want to get." And another is a loudmouth braggart saying, "Get the fuck out of here!" You know that one actor can do both of those, and do them convincingly. So that's one actor. But then another part, he's going to be a lover or something. He's got to be more gentle and more caring. And then you say, okay, we can get that guy can do 3 of them. So you count the actors you're going to need, and then you go home with a script. And you've got the script as a translation, but a very bad translation of the original script. So if it was Japanese, it's going to be a very bad translation of into English of the Japanese, let's say. You go in with that, and then you work out, okay, we can do, this guy can do this part, this guy can do these 3 parts, and also he'll be in the crowd scenes as well. So although there's 35 parts in this movie, we can do it with 7 actors. Then you work out how much you're going to pay each actor, and you work out by not shooting in sequence but putting the crowd scenes first and then getting rid of actors as you go along, what it's going to cost you in the cost of actors. And that's the way you do it. So and that works very well. So the system of costing it is the first thing. The owner of the film, or the guy we were dealing with, and we were dealing with Run Run Shaw, we were dealing with a chap called Dovin Chow, who ran one of Run Run Shaw's offshoots called Southern Films, who we did a lot of work with. And then, of course, with Raymond Chow and his company. But basically, you've got to work out the cost of it. And normally, they were all about the same, within 2,000 or 3,000 Hong Kong dollars of what you could get. You laid off the cost of the actors, the cost of the studio, and what was left was yours.
And generally, what was your role in the process? Were you the producer, supervisor, writer?
Everything. I mean, I founded the business because I realized, as someone who's a bit of a ham actor anyway, that it was kind of fun to do. Secondly, that because we were the only ones, we could make quite a bit of money out of it. And thirdly, because it was a very nice social event where you get together with, half a dozen old chums, sit around a microphone in a crowded room, and then later go out and have a bloody good blast of about a 7-course dinner and lots of drink. First you see the film, then you cost it, and then you got in dear old Ron Oliphant, my dear friend, who would come along and he'd see the film again, but by this time it's cut into loops. And loops about 1 minute, could anything from 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Obviously, it's a crowd scene, you let it run because crowd scenes are not lip synced normally, except when a face comes into close up, then you've got to lip sync that bit. And then he'd go through it and he'd do a tape recording, a 1/4-inch tape, and he'd take the tape home and he'd sit in a quiet room he kept for the purpose, and he'd inch through the tape, count the syllables, and make sure that his version of the English script, which was rewritten entirely, would match it syllable for syllable what was going to appear on the screen. So most of the work that you do normally by sitting in the studio trying and retrying to make it match was already done because it matched. All it needed was clever actors or accomplished actors who would watch it going through and then match it very easily because it was every syllable was counted to fit.
How many days and nights, or days or nights, did it take to dub an entire film?
Probably about anything from 12 to 16 hours. I mean, it was a very difficult one. It could take longer, but and it's a very easy one. It could take shorter. But I would say on an average about 12 to 20 hours. We worked from 6 p.m. to about midnight. Or if we could finish, if I could say, look, guys, if we stay beyond another 2 hours, we'll finish at 2 o'clock. We'll go out and have a blast, but you won't have to come back tomorrow night. So that meant they got paid and they didn't have to come the second night, and they had a good blast anyway.
Can you describe what the studio was like, how big it was, what was in there, what kind of equipment?
Very small. It was about, I would say, not bigger than about 200 square feet. And the dangers to our health, looking back on it, I wouldn't go in there even to look at a movie. It was thick with cigarette smoke. I mean, if there were 6 actors crouching around a microphone, concentrating, they had to smoke because people used to believe when they smoked the only way they could concentrate is to smoke. So they're all smoking and we're all breathing this stuff for like 6-8 hours at a time. Why we didn't all drop dead, I don't know. But anyway, most of us survived, touch wood.
Were you actually working on the Shaw Studios lot, or where was your facility located?
Oh no, we didn't. They were little dubbing studios. We were in a block of flats. So if there's a noise, if somebody started banging, we had to stop recording because it wasn't completely soundproof. And it was just like a flat. And they'd made the living room into a studio, and one of the bedrooms was the projector room, and they cut holes in the wall for the projectors, and that was how it worked. I think the one thing I contributed to both to broadcasting, to some part, not entirely of course, broadcasting and dubbing, is I invented the mid-Atlantic voice, because the Americans didn't like the British voice. They say, hello, old chap, how are you? Lovely to see you, because they didn't quite understand it. And the British didn't like the American accent because it was regarded as fairly low class. So what one had to do in dubbing, you had to produce what we called a mid-Atlantic accent, which wasn't too English, it wasn't too American, but was understandable by either. And so that's what I developed over a period of time. So my voice was used for a lot of stuff for when they were dubbing, when I wasn't in the actual film. But I have made a number of films too where I appear on screen, so it wouldn't be unlikely that I would be. In fact, even quite recently, done a few movies and enjoy it. It brings out the ham in me.
Your voice obviously is very recognizable immediately. Did you cultivate your speaking voice?
Yes, let me tell you the story. It's quite interesting.
All right.
I was brought up in the north of England. They have a terrible accent. I'll explain the difference to you in a minute. But when I started, I was a DJ, as I said, when I was in the Mediterranean, in Trieste and places. And I realized that the voice, the accent I had, and in England you can recognize where somebody comes from. If you ever saw Professor Higgins in My Fair Lady, you realize how easy it is. Where I came from, in the north of England, Cheshire, Lancashire, Yorkshire, if you want to say was like a couple of ducks, two ducks, you would say a couple of ducks. And if you were asked a Cockney to say the same thing, a couple of ducks, he'd say a couple of ducks. It's totally different. And all broadcasting was the BBC. There were no commercial stations then. So the BBC was the accent, and the BBC accent was standard Southern. So if you said a couple of ducks, you would never get a job broadcasting. So you learnt to iron out the accent. To a certain extent. I mean, nowadays it's not so important. In fact, a chap tends to have more character if he's got a regional accent. Not certain regional accents, but for example, if he's Scottish or Irish, he's usually welcomed as a different voice. But at that time, you had to be fairly neutral with a leaning to the southern accent. So yes, I did. I made a point of not being too north of England. And when I go up there, which I do occasionally still, they say, "Who the fuck are you? What's this new accent? You're talking like these posh people down south, aren't you?" Yeah, I had, because that's the only way you could get to work in broadcasting in those days.
You also have another career, right? You were a broadcaster and a television personality, isn't that true?
Yes.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about that.
Well, okay, well, first of all, of course, was radio, because there was no television in Hong Kong when I arrived here. No television had been set up. And there was only one radio station, and that was public service broadcasting, so there was no commercial radio. So I did what there was there. And I did that for several years. And then in 1967, I think it was, they set up television here. And of course, I went back to the BBC to do training as a television producer, first of all, a director, first of all. And then when I got back, there was no work in directing. So I went into on camera as an interviewer, which is the job I'd been doing in radio. So I was quite used to it. Then from that time on, I was doing quite a lot. I think about 4 television programs a week. And I was still doing radio, about 6 or 7 programs a week. So it was very difficult to get away from me for Ted Thomas haters. It was very difficult. There was one was called On Camera, and the other was called Be My Guest. And I did quite a lot of stuff when people came here to Hong Kong to do movies. I usually got small parts in the movies as well, because recognizing what an old ham I am, they knew I enjoyed it.
Did you ever appear in films back in the old days, like the 50s, 60s, when you were
Oh,
starting?
yeah. I mean, I appeared in things like the 60s with The World of Susie Wong.
Okay.
I'm still a very good friend of Nancy Kwan. A Many Splendid Thing, Love is a Many Splendid Thing, but all very minor parts, And I've seen them go through several times, and I really had to look to see which one was me.
I wondered if you remembered, I know you didn't do as many of them, but the Japanese monster films, you did several of them. And I wonder if you have any recollections of those and what special
Well, not
requirements
particularly, because the dialogue tended to be very minimal, actually. These movies depended a lot on special effects. And so there wasn't I wouldn't remember whether I'd been a scientist or chief of police. I remember I was chief of police in a Hong Kong movie about a monstrous gorilla that crawled up buildings here. And I was chief of police or head of the British Army in shooting it. I can't remember. And I've never seen the movie, I don't think. But I did a lot of movies. Don't forget, sometimes we did 6 or 7 a month. And this is, 40 years ago.
Right. No, I understand. No, the film you're talking about with the giant gorilla is called Mighty Peking Man, and you portray the head of the army unit that's fighting the monster.
That's
And
right, yes.
in a lot of these films, you play the villain. And
Yes.
yeah, I think your voice and your acting style is very suited to that. There's something a little bit sinister about your voice in certain roles.
Well, I like that. I like the roles of villains that seem to be a lot more interesting, a lot more colourful, and allow for a lot more scope in acting than good bad guys. You know.
Well, there's one in particular that I wish we could. I wish I could play it for you right now. It's another one of these Godzilla films that you worked on. The actor whose voice that you're substituting. There's a scene in which it's a very small scene where he gives the hero of the story. They're trying to follow him to his home, and the way they
Yeah.
do it is they give him a pack of cigarettes that has like a transmitter in it, and they're going to use that to track him, as he goes home. Anyway, it's just this one little line where you give him the cigarettes, and he looks at the pack and he goes, "Oh, cigarettes," and you said, "They're for you."
Yeah, that sounds like my part. Yes.
Come on, rise up now! To the earth, sir! Destroy the earth! Destroy our enemies!
I'll give you a good indication of dubbing now. At one point he says here, "Rise up now." Now, that's not natural speech. So obviously the Japanese, or whatever the original language is rise up, but you had another syllable to add on. So the writer put the word now in it.
Right.
See? This is the art of writing for film dubbing. And there's one saying in Chinese, particularly, no, Japanese, and it's a double-digit sound, which is, I can't remember what it was, but what we put in all the time was "so then." Anyway, so you find in a lot of movies we did, because it was one of our writers' peculiarities, now and again there'd be a pause in the speech and he'd say, "So then." And you had to put something in there. I mean, there was nothing, of course, there was nothing in the dialogue to suggest what it was. So we'd put in the word "so then," and it became a bit of a joke amongst film dubbing actors. Every now and again they'd say "so then."
There's also in a lot of Japanese films that are dubbed, the characters will say "right."
Yeah. You'd have to tell the writers not to put in "right" too often, because otherwise they'd fill the script with it.
Well, when you look back on that period of your life and all those thousands of films that you dubbed, I mean, how do you feel about it now? And what's your place in the history of this type of exploitation film, as we call
I
them?
think mainly a certain amount of satisfaction, because I do believe we were pioneers at this business in Hong Kong. I'm sure probably people in Italy and Yugoslavia and Germany and Britain think the same thing. But where Hong Kong's concerned, where Chinese films, we were pioneers. And of course, presumably, Run Shaw chose us because we were less expensive. We were in Hong Kong and we were using cheap flats for studios. So we were, in a way, pioneers, and that is very satisfying. Of course, I make a point of not seeing any of the movies now because I would cringe in embarrassment. But
And I'm glad that we were able to discuss this and hopefully shed a little bit of light on all the work that you did.